Hi.
Hello, everyone. Morning/afternoon, wherever you are. So the thing with these awkward in-between sessions, everyone else in the country is in a little bit of a different time zone usually. Um, I am admitting people in as we speak, but I'll start it with a bit of an introduction and we'll dive straight in. An hour is probably a bit of a tight time frame for today's session. But we'll keep everyone off on mute for now at least. And towards the end, we'll come to any questions and stuff. So please use the chat if you want to talk. And I'll be sure to come around to that at the end. So a bit of a brief introduction to myself. I'm Karen. I am a consultant here at Mirus. If you're not already familiar with us, I think a lot of people actually will be already existing clients in one way or another, or at least aware of Mirus. But if you're not already aware, we do work within the residential aged care space. We've got some technology and consulting services and products that we offer to the market here. And just lately, we know how frequently the changes have been coming up in the sector, especially around funding, cabinet requirements, reporting requirements as well. So it's making it nearly impossible to have that static set and forget type of mindset that we have had over the last few years in the residential facilities space. Not to forget, obviously, the usual operational challenges now as well. So we've invested heavily into this space and co-designed with the industry to create some technology products and also the supporting services to be able to enable everyone in the industry to manage all sides of their aged care businesses and actually do the hard work of looking after the residents that we're here to look after. So today is going to be a overview of the upcoming regulatory and legislative changes that we'll see coming up. We'll cover the new Aged Care Act, the regulatory model, the quality standards, each of the different quality standards, and we'll keep in mind, of course, that a lot of what we're discussing today is pending the passage of legislation. And we know that the government is quite committed to the new Aged Care Act to be planned to commence on the 1st of July, but that obviously a huge element of that is pending parliamentary passage as well. So when that happens, it'll be interesting to see. And the home care component, I know we've got some participants here today from the home care space as well. So that element will come in and it's meant to be built in from 2025. So a couple of years, still a year and a half or so to be able to do that. So today we'll have the opportunity to start to understand those changes better than probably purely reading what's been published, especially in the hundreds of pages last week with the new information that we've had. Plus, we'll be able to talk about how to manage a provider's risk in the future, all the while ensuring that we put our consumers, our older people, at the heart of everything that we do, because that's really why we're here in this sector. So I realize a very hot topic, especially timing wise. So stick with me. Put your questions and comments in the chat section. Like I said, as more and more people are joining as well, I'll rehash that. I will save time at the end, about 10-ish minutes, to make sure we can cover as many questions and comments as possible at the end. There might be some things that we already have answers to, and I'll cover that as we go along if I can. But this is obviously a developing news story as well in itself. So over time, if things don't have answers yet, we might find out answers in time, and I'll point that out where that is the case. Regardless, let's use this as an opportunity to discuss and have a conversation starter at least, to use the chat function and share your thoughts and questions and connect with others in the sector as well, so you can have that bit of a networking opportunity as well. Okay, let's have a look at the agenda. So as I said before, we'll do a bit of a high-level timeline overview. We'll look into the New Aged Care Act, the regulatory model, the 7 quality standards that will change to in the future, the risk monitoring and the risk proportionate approaches that the Commission will take for future in their regulatory approach. And then we'll close off with some proposed next steps and how to transition over into this new world in the future. Okay, so bit of a recap of the industry, and I purposely left a lot of the history out of it. And I think we've talked about it enough in our usual webinars and trainings as well. But of course, we all get the sense that it is a tough time, especially the last few months, but even more so last few years, even since the Royal Commission started off. We've had a lot of change in the sector. So a lot has been happening. Most recently, we've had the mandatory 200 total care minutes to be delivered. That's become a mandatory requirement. Plus, we've had the annual provider operations submissions required from October onwards, those two. This month, even, we've had the new requirements come in for governing body memberships and provider advisory bodies to be established. Plus the fact that last week on Thursday, we've had the exposure draft released for the bill for the New Aged Care Act as well. That gives us a lot more detail to chew on, and it's quite meaty and big. Hundreds of pages, lots of consultation papers and information that they've put out based on the feedback that they've received so far, plus the obvious draft bill itself as well, which is I think 350 pages or something. So as we all work through all that information, I'll share some of the key insights today that we've noticed. That's meant to come into effect the 1st of July. The government's quite committed around that, and we've seen even the Commission, the commitment come through when they've actually released the exposure draft bang on time, as they said they would last week. And so we can expect that to come through 1st of July, pending parliamentary passage. So when that does happen, we'll have the quality standards, the new strengthened quality standards come through, the new regulatory model come through, and then the associated changes to the single assessment system, the new accommodation framework, and national worker screening happening at the same time. When that also comes through, we'll see sometime in August or so the framework around financial and prudential monitoring, compliance and intervention change as well. That's already in development and being worked on, but the next phase is going to be able to happen after the New Aged Care Act has switched over and we've all changed over to that new system. October, so we're about 10 months away from the mandatory care minutes increasing to 215 total care minutes, and 44 minutes of those will be RN related. And then from next July, so 2025, we'll see an expansion of the National Quality Indicator Program as well, plus the Support at Home program that is obviously going to be based on the New Aged Care Act as well. So lots happening in the future still. Some of the stuff that's already been started to be worked on, and really interesting to see all this happen in the future. But let's talk about the Act to start off with. So we have the now the draft bill exposed. Actually, let's take a step back. I want to get a bit of a sense of the room. I've got 84, 85 people in this session now. I'm going to put up a quick participant poll just to see where everyone sits and who I'm talking to, get a bit of a room check. Just respond to the poll that I've put up here, and I'll be able to read who I'm talking to a little bit. So I'm interested to see where everyone sits in their planning for all these changes, especially now that I've covered the high-level timeline. How's everyone sitting? Seems like from the live poll, it seems like some people have already started. A lot of people will start in the new year. and some haven't started yet or haven't thought about it yet. But that's good to know. Very well. Okay. Wait a couple more seconds for more people to respond. Okay. So some people are already thinking about it, obviously, and hence you're here. But then for the people that haven't thought about it or will start in the new year, hopefully this gives you a bit of an insight into what to look for and what those initial steps might be that you start to take first up. Okay. So with the draft bill exposed now and very much on time, we have seen some solid details come out about the new Aged Care Act. But this picture is very much a summary of the changes that we can expect with the different legislation. So the current legislation in the orange down the bottom and the proposed framework in the purple at the top. Highlighting the key 5 areas that we can see there. And a lot of the information that I'm sharing in pictures and stuff and slides here, a lot of the information that I'm saying as well, all of this is communications that have been put out by the department and the commission already, or publications that they have already made as well. So if you're looking for this information elsewhere, you will find it. Might be a matter of, just digging a little bit. For those of us that are new to the realm of aged care, I know someone just commented in the chat there as well. The current Aged Care Act was made in 1997, and it defines the responsibilities of an approved provider in relation to the quality of the aged care that they provide, including responsibilities of a provider to comply with the quality standards. But in the Royal Commission, they really found that the current act was no longer fit for purpose, and was really structured around the providers themselves and how to fund them, and not so much about the people accessing those services and what they need. So the proposed new Aged Care Act will be rights-based. It'll include a new statement of principles along with a new statement of rights, which I'll go into in a little bit more detail, to form that overarching legislation to support that new regulatory model for the aged care services in Australia. Now, I say broadly aged care services because it's going to be inclusive of all types of services. So we'll see home care and residential talked about in different ways. And for today, I'm mostly going to reference the residential space because that's where we operate, but at the same time know that this is all applicable and home care is included in that legislation as well. So we know that the Commission is aiming for this new act to ensure the older person who needs aged care is truly at the centre of the aged care system. And while we don't have the time to go into deep dives in this hour or so into each of those items, you can find very clear evidence of the level of expectations that's increasing in the communications that they've been putting out. So the Act will provide that framework for the fundamental change within the aged care sector, and it will replace the existing Aged Care Act 1997, along with the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission Act that was in 2018. So some of the feedback from the first round of consultation, there's plenty of consultation documents around this and what they've heard in this feedback. But the big key things that they've identified is that they wanted to refine the statement of rights and the statement of principles. So that's the big change that we've seen in the exposure draft come through. They're also looking at ways to more clearly define high quality care. So that definition has become really refined since the original version, and that's measurable and aligned with other components of the new Aged Care Act as well. Plus the fact that they're clarifying the interaction of the proposed nominee arrangements with the existing state and territory guardianship and power of attorney regimes as well. So consultations drew out a lot of different opinions, competing views as well of whether a duty of care should be extended to aged care workers and responsible persons of registered providers. And these are changes you can see in the exposure draft now. So if you want to go through a lot more detail, There is that information available. I realize today is going to be very much a summary and a very high level overview of the Act and the regulatory model and the standards in themselves, but there's a lot more that we could go into, and we're actually creating a more detailed course on this as well, aiming to launch around February in the new year. So we'll come to that at the end. But here's the key things that we want everyone to be aware of already, if not yesterday. So the structure and the constitutional foundation is changing with the new Act. It will be rights-based. It differs from the current Act in that it's structured around, the current Act is structured around the approved providers and how they're funded, like I said before. But the new Aged Care Act will aim to be person-centred. It relies on international conventions such that it includes the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So this basically means that this will allow for a wider range of businesses to enter the market where only limited funded services were previously available. And now by doing that, of course, we've got the fact that older people will be better supported to gain access to funded aged care services, allowing them to live that active, self-determined and meaningful life that they have been wanting to. But that obviously requires a cultural shift as well. So the Act will support that culture change across the sector with promotion of innovative initiatives based on research that support continuous improvement. And those are terms that we keep hearing so far as well, repeatedly, but a lot more referencing happening to those terms now, and a lot more focus on that in the future as well, in the legislation itself, but also the regulatory model and the standards when we go into more details. So I'll touch on the rights first, and then we'll go into the principles and how they're different. The Statement of Rights will be the centerpiece of the new Aged Care Act. It's meant to be symbolic, but also very practical and applicable to day-to-day as well. It's outlining the specific rights of people seeking or accessing the funded aged care services, and it's proposed to include 12 rights now. I think originally they had 16, but in the nature of the feedback and the consultation that they've done, they've narrowed it down to 12 now. That have been developed based on the current Charter of Residents' Rights and recommendations from the Royal Commission, as well as the suggestions and feedback from stakeholders as well. So the Statement of Rights will be different to the Statement of Principles, but it is complementary as well. So Statement of Rights, very easy to understand. They've actually changed the structure of it a little bit as well and split it up into sections within the statement to make it really simple and easy to understand under clear headings as well. So very clear statement of rights now, but at the same time, there's been a few changes. If you were following the previous version, now you'll notice that there's recognition of a right to delivery of services by appropriately qualified and skilled workers of registered providers, consistent with the requirements imposed on the providers themselves as well. So we'll see the recognition of the need for accessibility of complaints mechanisms and of assessment and reassessment processes for those living with dementia or other cognitive impairments, palliative and end-of-life care and equitable access to those services is really highlighted in there now as well. Plus specific references to some key themes like spirituality, connectedness with reference to role of pets, friends, community services, public life, especially for the community and the country and the significance of that for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander persons as well. That's been referenced quite clearly. Same for intimate and sexual relationships as well, freedom from sexual misconduct and coercion, and communication methods, and having other methods available that can allow access to different services as well, plus the cultural safety point, trauma aware and healing informed service delivery. So all those things being mentioned quite explicitly in the Act itself, in the legislation itself, but also we know that when they're mentioned so obviously, it will trickle down into the standards and the regulatory reform as well in a lot more detail. The statement of principles are slightly different to the statement of rights in that the principles are intended to guide the decisions, the actions, and the behaviours of everyone that's operating in the aged care system. So that includes the department and the commission, and they've proposed 14 principles now, but a lot of them talking about a range of different topics. There's dignity of respect obviously mentioned in there, but there's specific mentions of First Nations peoples. There's a huge focus on enablement, access to culturally appropriate services, again, a big theme, and a focus on feedback and complaints, continuous improvement, contemporary evidence-based practices, best practice, and innovation. So a lot of that keywords sort of coming through as well, and a lot more focus on it. So considering the two different things, the statement of rights and the statement of principles playing a really important but different role to deliver that cultural change in the aged care sector. They've also taken in the feedback that they received so far, the department have also taken into account the fact that there needs to be a lot more active and empowering language into the statement of principles. So that's the other thing that's changed. They've made a clear link between the rights and the principles as well, and removed duplicative concepts, which is why the number's gone down a little bit. I think they originally started with 15 statement of principles in the statement of principles, and now it's 14. And that's obviously led to the streamlining of the principles as well. Let's talk about the high quality care definition. So that is meant to ensure the aged care system puts older people first and focuses on the characteristics of care rather than the specific outcomes. So by defining what high quality care means, the theory is that the system will ensure that there's no place for substandard care, and that the system, as it matures, high quality care just becomes the norm eventually. So proposed definitions, there's some concepts in the sector we are already well aware of and aim for generally, but there are others that I'll call out that we're not so familiar with or we're not so good at yet. And so those are some of the things that are around self-determination, for example. So there is that kindness, compassion, respect for life experiences, of course, but self-determination, dignity, mental health and well-being, and the focus on that is a bit of a newer thing. There's mentions of specific tailoring of care to personal needs, aspirations, and preferences of the individual, which I think we've been doing a little bit of, but not to this degree. Supporting the environment, the improvement of the individual's physical and cognitive capacity is also specifically mentioned. There's also mentions of meaningful and respectful activities and remaining connected to the community, the natural environment, the animals, the pets, all of that connection, ability to participate and supporting the individual to participate in those activities is mentioned in there. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander persons, their connection to family and community, culturally safe practices, culturally appropriate practices, and accessible care for them has a specific call out in itself, and culturally appropriate care with diverse life experiences, including they've specifically mentioned engaging workers with lived experience of diversity in the provider's workforce and the governing body, plus specific mentions around bilingual aged care workers and interpreters being made available. So a lot more detail that they're going into around high quality care now. There's new statutory duties as well and compensation pathways. So addressing feedback around unintended consequences and disincentivization eventually. A breach of the duty will also only occur where the provider engages in conduct that amounts to serious failure, with higher penalties available where conduct results in the actual death of, or serious injury to, or illness, or the individual to whom they owe the duty. That is all based on strong feedback regarding the additional duty on aged care workers. So that duty has not been included in the exposure draft, which was pitched in the original consultation papers that they had put out. But there are statutory duties still for registered providers and for responsible persons still to reinforce that responsibility across all parts of the aged care system. So consistent with the Royal Commission recommendations, and especially around that high quality care as well, there is a higher civil penalty also available where the provider is in breach of their registration, and it involves the significant failure or a systemic pattern of conduct as well. So different statutory duties will be put in place. There's a lot more detail around this available that we can go into and we can explore more if we had more time. There's also the fact that the Act will include a compensation pathway in certain circumstances where a registered provider breaches their statutory duty. So there's a specific section in the exposure draft that provides for a relevant court to order a registered provider found guilty of the criminal offence to compensate an individual for the serious injury or illness that's been caused by the commission of the offence as well. So there's different measures been put in place. The other big one is around whistleblower protections, and the aim is to broaden out the whistleblower protections with these new changes in line with the protections that are under NDIS Act and the Corporations Act as well. So the key thing to note here is that their whistleblowers will have protections that include civil liability, criminal liability, contractual or other remedy, and administration liability as well. So these protections are aiming to protect the whistleblowers from any retribution. The current victimization protections will also be retained in the new Act. And we've got the fact that the new Act is seeking to provide much stronger safeguards and empowerment to the whistleblowers. So as such, there's no longer going to be a need to provide their name to be offered protection as a whistleblower. And in the recent consultations as well, they've also removed the condition of good faith when making the disclosure. So they have also expanded the types of people who will be able to make a disclosure, such that pretty much anyone can now be a whistleblower. Couple of last little things around supported decision making and the eligibility for funded aged care services. So supported decision making, there's the opportunity now in the new Aged Care Act to clarify that role of the legal representatives and their responsibilities, with the aim to ensure people maintain their cognitive abilities to support their autonomy and self-determination. So it's trying to get rid of the confusions around legal representative versus representative versus nominated representative versus regular versus authorized representative versus agent. There's so much going on. In future, there will be either a supporter or a representative. So supporters are able to receive documents and information and communicate information on behalf of the older person. Representatives will do the same things as the supporter, and they can make decisions on behalf of the older person when they don't have the capacity to do so, or the older person wants the representative to make a decision on their behalf. So there's the new Act will encompass that decision-making principles and duties that the supporters and representatives will need to adhere to. There's been recent edits made to make sure that multiple supporters and multiple representatives can be appointed for the older person, and there's a lot more detail around how they are appointed, suspended or cancelled. as well as the administrative process around all of that as well. So you can look into it more if you're interested in there. And then finally, for the eligibility side of things, we know that system entry will be simplified in the future. So we'll have a common entry point for access and a single assessment framework. The process will include an initial application and then initial eligibility testing, followed by individual needs assessments, which will result in an approval decision, and if they're successful, the grant of access. So to be able to use aged care services, the person will have to provide information about their care needs, but they will also need to be either 65 years or older or 50 years or older if they're ATSI, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person, or homeless or at risk of becoming homeless. So based on the consultation and the feedback so far, the department is looking for more feedback around the age brackets and who can access, especially in the home and community environment, and a couple of other parts around the Act as well. Consultation round 2 is open now. So if you're interested and want to be more engaged in that side, feel free to do that. There is information out there. Okay, that's the Act. In a brief summary, we're going to touch on the regulatory model now itself, and then we'll go into the standards themselves as well, each of them. So far, with the Act obviously in consultation still, we will hear more about the regulatory model in the future as well. It's a bit of a tongue twister. As we progress towards that go live date in July next year, we'll hear more details around this, but this is what we know so far. So there is a summary of the key concepts and the insights that are available from the consultation and documents that they've put out so far. The new model will support those planned reforms to in-home aged care as well, and responds directly to the Royal Commission recommendations. And once it is finalised, it will be included in the new Aged Care Act and the supporting legislation, as I said. So to deliver consistent, high-quality care to older people, the model is aiming very specifically to drive that cultural change towards across the sector, but also adopt the relationship-based relational regulation that they've talked about in the past as well, to build stronger working relationships, deeper trust, and also more transparency in the sector as well. So that means providers will be incentivized to improve, and there will also be escalating enforcement actions available to the Commission as well, for people on the other side of the spectrum. And we'll talk about it a little bit when we talk about the risk monitoring and the regulatory approach of the Commission itself. But providers that do not respect older people's rights, fail to improve or deliver high quality care and put people at risk of harm will face strong enforcement action from the Commission. They've been quite explicit around that. So when we look into more detail, they're calling them safeguards as such, but there's 4 key tools that are arranged across these 4 pillars there. Mitigating that risk of harm to older people, increasing protections for older people, and encouraging continuous improvement are central to the new model as well. And so with that comes these 4 pillars that you can see. So supporting quality care is very much around greater emphasis on that relational regulation that the Commission talked about before. They're aiming to help drive cultural change and improve quality care outcomes for older people. It's aiming to create that responsive and collaborative environment for providers to engage with the Commission and the department on innovation, continuous improvement, and to seek support and advice to avoid non-compliance with their responsibilities in the future. And we're seeing a little bit of that change of approach already in the communications that they've been putting out or the audits that they have been doing, but at the same time, it's one of those major changes that will happen, especially when the new Act comes through, and we'll talk about it in a second, the changes to audits that are happening in the future as well, with the quality standards changing and how that graded assessment will change as well. That is all to incentivize providers to continuously improve and strive for excellence. So the outcomes of the audits are there to share the plans of continuous improvement with older people, but also to work with their consumer and quality advisory bodies, which have now been put in place from this month, I think, to implement and sustain these improvements over time as well. So they are incentivizing high quality care through a few different approaches. There's, of course, the performance reporting being published quite publicly now, and for greater transparency, but also for motivation to continuously improve. There's the fact that they're promoting good performance and will be celebrating success within the sector in the future as well. Promotions on different websites, graded assessments that I talked about. So I'll just flick over. This is what the new graded assessments will potentially look like. So everyone in the different, there will be different registration categories, but the people that will go through audits, providers that do go through audits will go through that to determine if they have the right systems, policies and procedures to meet the quality standards. And when they're re-registering as well, they will be audited to assess their conformance to the quality standards. And this is what the conformance grades will look like. So instead of the current framework that we have right now, or of either conforming or not conforming, we'll have a graded approach and drawing inspiration from the NDIS model possibly here. We've got the specific and concrete criteria that will be developed to assist with the audits, and the results of that will come out to determine the provider's level of conformance with the quality standards. The second part around becoming a provider is unique as well. So universal provider registration and re-registration is proposed to replace the current approved provider arrangements under the existing Act. That will apply to all providers delivering Commonwealth subsidised aged care services, so broadly in the sector. There is proposals to allow for non-corporations as well, perhaps sole traders and partnerships to register to deliver in-home aged care services. That's a bit of a watch that space, but there will be 6 registration categories proposed, and I'll flick over to the slide next, which they shared last week in the webinar. They're grouping services now based on common characteristics and associated service risks and provider obligations to address those risks as well. So providers will register into one or more category. For residential providers, of course, we'll have that last category that's requiring conformance with all standards, 1 to 7, all of them. But there are others for the in-home or the different service models that might be interested in this to look into more detail. But yeah, so providers can register into one or more categories with a subset or all of the services in each category to be delivered, and there will be new audit process, of course, which they're still ironing out a little bit, so we'll probably hear more about it in the new year. Responsibilities of the provider will obviously change as well, so with the overarching obligations being different to the core conditions of registration, plus category-specific conditions of registration, plus provider-specific conditions of registration, which will be determined by the Commission to manage any risks associated with specific providers. So there will be different gradings of those obligations in themselves as well. We know that a breach of a condition of registration generally will attract a civil penalty of up to 250 penalty points, which they've talked about last week as well, and then the higher penalty of up to 500 penalty points is available when the breach involves a significant failure or is part of a systemic pattern of conduct as well. And that's terminology that they've pulled out of their new Aged Care Act, and they will be putting into place in the future as well. So a bit of a watch this space to see what those exactly mean when we go through the details and the nitty-gritty of the Act as well. And then lastly, holding providers accountable, and this is where the regulatory approach that I will talk about in a little bit becomes really important. But the rights foundation for the new Aged Care Act is to ensure the protection and the promotion of the rights of older people, and that's really central to the new aged care system. So having that explicitly clear language now, older people will be encouraged and empowered to exercise their rights. And there will also be pathways under the new Aged Care Act, as we saw before, to seek for those rights to be upheld. There will be civil penalties and offences that can apply where the registered provider has not met their obligations, and that could include conditions on their registration itself. There's separate obligations that are also placed on the responsible persons, and possibly we'll see on the aged care workers as well, including to comply with the Code of Conduct itself. So the Commissioner can revoke or suspend a provider's registration. We'll see more detail around what their powers are in a little bit. There's also criminal penalties that are established where registered providers or their responsible persons breach the new statutory duties designed to target serious poor quality or unsafe care. So compensation pathways that we talked about, the new statutory duties, this is where all of that becomes really important. We talked about that. Okay, let's talk about the quality standards briefly, and then we'll come to questions towards the end. I'm going to do a quick overview because there's so much in the standards, but also there's so much more coming with the new Act as well. I'm going to do a bit of an overview of these, but of course we are, as I said before, doing a lot more detailed training around this in the future. So 7 standards hopefully gives you the 7 key takeaways out of the 10 as well here. But we'll walk through each of them now. So standard 1 is very much that underpinning the way the providers and workers are expected to treat older people, and it is relevant to all the rest of the standards. It's meant to be that overarching one, which you can see why it's highlighted in the center there in a bigger format. Then we've got the fact that it goes into a lot more detail now as well. So there's important concepts around dignity and respect, on people's individuality, diversity, independence, choice and control. That language has changed a little bit more like disability now, culturally safe care, and the dignity of risk, of course, as well. So these are all important in fostering a sense of safety, autonomy, inclusion, and quality of life for older people there. We have seen that throughout the strengthened standards, there is that introduction of trauma-aware and healing-informed care, quite specifically mentioned as part of the transition planning, of course, as well. But there's a lot more considerations now, especially with many older people who transition into residential aged care or require home care services for the first time. They often have that experience of a form of trauma. So that's something to think about, and what supports your organisation can put in place to recognise those challenges, but also how your organisation can provide tailored supports for each older person. So standard 2, a lot more about the organisation. The strength and focus that we see in this one, a lot of the key concepts are coming from existing standards 6 and 7 and 8. But there's a lot more focus now on partnering with older people to inform their care and services, quality and safety culture, very explicitly mentioned, workforce planning, and emergency and disaster management, very explicitly mentioned, separate actions around each of those as well. So a lot more attention in that well. Standard 3 is around the care and the services. So comes the inspiration has been here from the current standard 2, as well as parts of 3 and 4. But there's a lot more focus on supporting people with dementia, living with dementia. So that's a lot of the conversation that we have been hearing and the communications that have been put out by the Commission around this already. The work has started around this already. But there's also the fact that they're supporting re-ablement, including contemporary best practice, not just best practice. Quality of life must be supported, supporting early identification, early interventions, re-ablement, of course, and involving the person in selecting their workers. So a fair few key changes, especially around coordination of care as well, especially transitions across care environments. The environment itself, I think, has been something that's been on our radars in the sector already, but they have clarified now to include specific actions to identify and discuss with the older person any environmental risks that the older person's home has and how those can be mitigated. The service environment, of course, needs to be fit for purpose, but there's also specific mentions around infection prevention and control as well, appointing an infection control lead. So a lot more detail that they've gone into. 5, 6, and 7 are things that are particularly relevant for residential aged care. So this is where providers need to perk their ears up. There's a specific mention around digital clinical information systems, which I think we should all be working towards already, if not already there. So that's a new requirement for providers to work towards, implementing a digital clinical information system. Plus there's separate sections and a lot more detail around medication safety and specific clinical risks as well. So there's very detailed mentions around that. But some of these retained concepts that we have already been working towards are also retained there. Food and nutrition is a separate standard in itself, which makes sense why the Commission has been talking and putting out separate communications around this and holding webinars and all that stuff around the work around it so far. This one is intended to apply only to residential aged care services so far, but there's a lot more focus on partnering with older people. There's assessing the person's nutritional needs, what they would like to eat, how they would like to eat and drink, the provision of those things, and providing a enjoyable dining experience. So they're recognizing a lot more detail and specific outcomes around this, new actions around this as well when you go into the detail. This last one is very much around residential communities only, so only applicable to those residential care services. Some of the key ones that I will highlight is on the right there. So that strength and focus around minimizing boredom and loneliness, which is getting a specific call out now. Supporting people to contribute to their community. Psychological safety is getting called out specifically, and of course dementia again, which is a big theme. So very quick, very high level view of the standards. There will be more consultation happening, and they've done a pilot on these standards already. So we'll hear more communications about this in the new year, and hopefully that detailed course is a better place for us to talk about it in more detail. Just to close off, that risk proportionate approach and that risk-based monitoring approach that the Commission will take, this is the pictorials that they have been using so far, but the Commission's risk monitoring approach can already be seen in action and is going to be emphasised even more in the new regulatory model, as I said before. It's really informed by data and regulatory intelligence that signals a risk or issue that needs additional monitoring or a response. So providers are reporting so much more now in comparison to previous years, and the Commission is expected to use all that data that they are getting access to be able to build a picture of risk for each provider. Through ongoing monitoring, oversight, complaints, and all of that stuff, the provider is not respecting older people's rights and is delivering substandard care will come into the attention of the Commission, of course. So they are doing risk profiling and targeting. They're doing site audits as usual, of course, but investigation and case management and directions and notices will be put out in future. So we know Janet Anderson has been quite explicitly been quoted telling providers that if they ignore the nudge or if the high risks are identified, they will reach out for power tools, they won't door-to-door, they'll step in, no fear or favour, because that's their job. But at the same time, she has acknowledged that data shows that most of the time the Commission has no need to reach for a regulatory tool, and there have been green shoots of improvements, for example, that they mentioned at ACPA earlier in the year. So that is something to keep an eye out for in terms of data and intelligence-wise. We know that providers will come from a range of sources, that data and intelligence will come from a range of sources, including provider registrations, complaints, reportable incidents, provider notifications and reporting itself, but also audit outcomes, worker screening in the future, the department and the other regulators that will share information with the Commission as well, of course. So this is going to be supported where appropriate by that tell us once, use multiple times type approach that they're collecting information around. As with the current approach, there are going to be appropriate checks in place to ascertain the accuracy of the information, and we're already seeing some audits happen around this, like the department's care time reporting audits that are happening. But also the regulator considers where they do consider the provider or the service to be high risk to an older person, they will be prioritised for risk-based monitoring, and they will take action to be able to control that in the future. So they will be able to apply to a court for a civil penalty. They can issue infringement notices like a fine or a notice of a fine. They could apply to court for an injunction as well, but also accept or enforce actions that a provider agrees to take. So there will be required action notices in the future versus compliance notices and adverse action warning notices that they've talked about recently last week. But they're also still considering extra powers for the Commissioner themselves as well. So where there is immediate risk to health and safety of people in residential aged care services, or the provider is unable to pay their debts from a financial prudential requirements side of things, those powers would only be used by the Commission if they believe that the provider cannot address the situation in any other ways, but there will be powers allocated to the Commission, for example, there. So what do we do in future? I'm just going to bring Bree on board for a change of voice, a change of face. She's one of our really brilliant, talented business development managers to talk about what things we could do to prepare for all this in the future.
Thank you, Taryn, and I'm going to get you to introduce me all the time because that was a lovely introduction. Thank you very much. As Taryn mentioned, my name is Bree. I'm part of the sales development team here at Mirus, and I'm just going to quickly touch on two of the services that we will be offering to help you through this change. Because as Taryn mentioned, this doesn't happen very often, and for a lot of us, none of us have been through an act change before. This is brand new. So the first service is the Aged Care Regulatory Transition Service. Think of this as an in-depth project. So we get embedded with your team right from the beginning, right from conception, and sit down and look at where you currently are at in terms of where the Act sits and what you need to do to be compliant. And through each step of the way, we'll be with you, help you plan, put actions in place, and guide you through until you're at that endpoint, until you're happy with where you need to be. We'll also work across all parts of the organisation to make sure that everyone's involved in the service. Next one for me. Thank you, Taryn. The other option we have, I'm sure some of you know that Mirus have the Mirus Academy, and we will also be offering a 3-hour course to help upskill you and your teams in the new Aged Care Act. So the Regulatory Reforms Explained course, if you scan the QR code there, you can jump in and register. But there's a couple of ways we can actually help deliver this for you. First of all, again, you can jump into one of our regular, normally monthly sessions that we hold for these courses. Or if you want to do something for your organisation, get a group together and deliver all in one go and upskill everyone at once, more than welcome to have a chat about that. Jump on our website and fill in a form, and we'll be able to give you some more information. And if you do have any more questions out of today, Taryn will just click over to the contacts. So the key people who will be running the regulatory reform service will be Andrew and Katie. They'll be the lead partners, so always there to support you and answer any questions. And Shannon and I are part of the sales team. So you can reach us either on the information there on the slide, and just so you know, the recording will be shared after this, so you can always jump on there, or if you come onto the website, you'll be able to complete an inquiry form. So thank you, Taryn. I'm going to hand over to you for some questions.
Thanks, Bree. Thanks. We haven't had much action in the chat, so feel free to put anything in there if you're curious. Someone was asking about the standards, so I'll flick over the slides while we talk about the rest of them. Standard 3, someone was talking about. Joanne said, can a provider have multiple categories based on the services they offer if they have multiple sites? Yes, they can. And that's something that we'll see a little bit more information come out around, especially around the regulatory reform. So I know there is more publication around it, but of course the Act will inform so much of the model when it does come out. So it's not set in stone just yet. You had your other question around, does compliance to core standards 1 to 4 also apply to categories 1 to 3? I didn't think so. No, so that's at the moment they're saying that these standards won't apply to category 1, 2, or 3 so far, but they will also have other requirements to provide services generally. So just normal consumer rights and that sort of detail only. Do you have any detail regarding the national worker screening changes? So far, there's been very little put out on that so far, Sandy. So as we do find out more, we will talk about it a lot more. Yeah, it's one of those watch this space sort of realms so far. John's question, what's the new requirements on rights? I'm not sure what you mean, John. Are you talking about the statement of rights, perhaps? If that is so, I think the part where we covered it around the New Aged Care Act, I think there's 12 statement of rights, rights that are included in the statement of rights, but they're very much clearly mentioned in the exposure draft itself. There's also consultation papers out that talk about the exact wording around those statement of rights. It is something that's open to consultation still as well, so they could change a little bit more in the future. Keep asking for slides. There will be a recording of this session available, and you'll probably get an automated email with the links and stuff available there. So yes, you'll have slides through that way. And what do providers have to do? Oh, yeah. Okay, John, I get what you mean. Yeah, so the rights in themselves, because they're so, I guess, fresh, but they've also been split up into different sections. So if I pull out the full explanation around it, we could go into a lot more detail around it. But the fact of the matter is that it goes into a lot more detail and recognizes some key themes that I talked about before, especially around the things around palliative and end-of-life care, specific references to spirituality and connectedness of references to role of pets and friends and community and being able to be more engaged in the community, cultural safety being the other big theme. So all those specific mentions that I made earlier were things that I think have been done well in pockets, perhaps, but not as a whole, as a sector. So perhaps that's something to consider for providers, and how well you're doing that already might be something to assess first up before you start putting measures in place to be able to do better on those. Katrina mentioning, can you repeat briefly what you said about the general duty, which was a part of the consultation paper, but not in the exposure draft? Will there be more information as to why the duty was left out? There is a lot more, yeah, so there is more detail around that, placing a statutory duty on aged care workers themselves, which has been taken out now purely because of the feedback that they got in the consultation process, that there would be unintended consequences and disincentivization of like, it's already so hard to get workers into the sector. They didn't want to put additional responsibilities and duties on the aged care workers themselves. So with that background, they have taken that duty out, but there is still the statutory duties for registered providers themselves and for responsible persons still. So still responsibilities to be able to meet the different requirements and compensation pathways that are still going to be left in place there. There is more information available though, Katrina. If you look through even just the consultation summary document that's been put out last week, it talks about it in there for more details if you're interested. Okay, considering time, I think we might call it there. But thanks everyone, and do reach out if there is anything that we can help you guys with, especially around future services. I'll put out these QR codes again, but do reach out to us. And if nothing else, keep an eye out for the February course that'll go into a lot more detail around the regulatory reforms as well. Alrighty, I'll call it there. Thanks everyone. Have a good day and happy holidays, however you choose to celebrate.